I haven't seen what Lynn Williams has done to be dropped. She's not quite the goal scorer at the international level that she is at the club level, but I think I've always been an advocate for all of the other things that she does very well can make up for that if you put her into the right system. I don't think it's an either or with Morgan or an either or with Macario or even with Smith. I do think it could just be a numbers game, but I do hope that she continues to be considered because I would like to think that her increased versatility, not only on her ability to play centrally in addition to wide, but also just how she's continued to compete at the club level as a goal scorer is something that's worth consideration. All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to a special YouTube exclusive edition of The Late Sub. You know, we had to do it. We have a new U.S. Women's National Team roster, the first of the Emma Hayes era, dropped on Tuesday, May 21st. We are recording this on Wednesday, May 22nd. This is go time. This is crunch time for the U.S. for the 2024 Olympics. We're seeing a lot of the big picture come into place, and so we wanted to dive in, discuss this on its own, because there's a lot to get into. So we're just going to start by reading the whole roster, and then we're going to get into things kind of overall, big picture, and then positionally. So let's start with the goalkeepers. 3 goalkeepers: Jane Campbell, Aubrey Kingsbury, Casey Murphy. Tierna Davidson, defenders: Tierna Davidson, Emily Fox, Naomi Girma, Casey Kruger, Jenna Neiswanger, Emily Sonnet, and Sam Staub. Midfielders: Corbin Albert, Sam Coffey, Hal Hirschfeld, Lindsay Horan, Rose Lavelle, and Lily Johannes. And our forwards will be Crystal Dunn, Katarina Macario, Alex Morgan, Trinity Rodman, Jaden Shaw, Sophia Smith, and Mallory Swanson. Interesting group. In addition to these 23, Olivia Moultrie, Croy Bethune, and Kate Weisner will be in as training players, so it's going to be a total group of 26, with 23 players available for 2 friendlies against the Republic of Korea at the beginning of June. This is an interesting mix. It's not completely surprising in some ways. It's 19 players from the She Believes Cup roster in April, but it does return Rose Lavelle to the mix. And a number of these players, maybe more interestingly, have been or are or have been on minutes restrictions for their clubs. So what does this mean, big picture, looking at the beginning of this Emma Hayes era? A couple things. Maybe these are caveats before we actually do get into some of the positional analysis. I'm not entirely sure these positional designations matter. When they go into the press release, you see something like Emily Sonnet as a defender. You see Crystal Dunn as a forward. You think, oh my gosh, is this the beginning of a new concoction sort of on the field for the U.S.? Maybe in a different year, I would say yes. I would say, okay, new coach coming in, experimentation time. But for an Olympic roster, you'd kind of have to decontextualize 2 things. You have to decontextualize position, and you have to decontextualize starting. Because this is a tournament where the games are fast and furious. There's very little turnaround, quite a bit of travel, and you have 18 players to see your way through what is a senior level competition for the women's side. So you have to sort of let go of those ideas of what is this player's position. You can certainly argue what's their best position to be placed on the field, but if you make an Olympic roster, it's because you can play usually multiple places at the drop of a hat. And also, you kind of have to go away from this idea of like, here are the starters and here are the substitutes, because there is no way to make it through a competition like this without pretty heavy rotation. And so I always find these debates around an Olympic year interesting, because I do think sometimes they are quite different than a World Cup, where maybe those 2 things, you talk about depth, you talk about players that are going to be sitting on the bench, maybe don't get a lot of playing time, more like training players. For the Olympics, those players are literally alternates, right? They cannot make a game roster. So that's my first caveat, I think. Not entirely sure what to read into positions until we start to see players playing games, and also not entirely sure what to make of maybe upcoming starting 11s versus players coming off of the bench, because I think you have to think of it sort of as a living organism from game to game. That's kind of how the Olympics work at this juncture. I would love for them to make some adjustments to make it closer to what a World Cup play would be like if it's going to remain a senior level competition, but this is what we have for right now. My other final caveat when analyzing, this is going to probably be true from now until probably the end of the Olympics, is we're nearing this point of sort of analytical, like double analysis, because I think when you're sitting here and you're analyzing what a coach is doing, we're going to have hopefully a chance to speak to Emma Hayes sometime in the near future. You can analyze maybe what you as the commentator would do, the hot takes, the things that you think they're getting wrong, the things that you would change, the players that you think should be in a different position, the tactics you think you would change. But there's also sort of this burden of sort of analyzing what you think the coaching staff is doing. What is their internal logic? Because you always want to give them the benefit of the doubt of there is internal logic here. Is it stuff that I always agree with? Not necessarily, but how do we sort of synthesize what we think the team is doing versus what we think the team perhaps should be doing? So those are kind of my big picture thoughts looking at a roster like this. My other thought is I do think, going back to minutes restrictions, you look at a player like Tierna Davidson, minutes restrictions. Naomi Girma was on minutes restrictions recently. A player like Alex Morgan or a player like Jaden Shaw, who have been kind of sitting out. I do kind of get the sense that if fitness is not a prerequisite, so full 90 fitness is not a prerequisite for this roster, that does lead me to believe that this group, this 23-player group, perhaps extended to the 26, those 3 training players, is the group that Hayes would like to carve an 18-player roster out of. That would be why you would bring in players who maybe can't play a full 90 in games, but you need to see them in the environment. This is also the double-edged sword of where the United States finds themselves with Hayes having her first camp 4 games before the Olympics, only 2 games before she has to make her final roster decisions. So I do think that we have to take this 23-player group seriously, very much so. I think there is an 18-player roster that Hayes likes out of this group. However, I don't think that takes the pressure off of these 23 players, again, maybe extend to 26. They have to prove maybe that they can do it. Like I said, I think in a weird way, these players are both at the beginning of the race and near the finish line. Because not only have they made it this far, they've made it through kind of this Twyla Kilgore period of evaluation, and they've played well in their clubs to make it to this 23-player roster, right next to the point of the final roster being named. But they also are kind of re-auditioning for a brand new coach. Again, why I think we're seeing players come in who might not be full 90 fit. So we have kind of this maybe bigger competitive environment where Hayes has the people maybe on paper that she would like to see play in the Olympics. But she needs to see if those players can contribute right in front of her. And this is going to be her first opportunity to see that in person. So I do find all of this very interesting, and I think it could lead to some surprises. So maybe when we're going to get into talking maybe about snubs or like I said, maybe surprises on this roster, I don't think that players off of the roster should think that this is the end, but it's no longer necessarily in their hands. I think at this point you would need a player to not be able to execute in camp to be not in consideration if you were on this 23-player roster. So let's start with the goalkeepers. Now that I said my piece about all the larger things that I think are happening, let's get into player by player how this looks. It's a really interesting mix. I do not think Hayes is completely thinking just about the Olympics. There is still a long game being played here with these 23 players that go beyond 2024, get closer to 2027. Goalkeepers, Jane Campbell, Aubrey Kingsbury, Casey Murphy. So Alyssa Nair has been out with a thigh injury that left her out of Chicago's game last weekend. That must be severe enough that she is not able to come into camp for this international break. If there is any player that I would go, this is purely about fitness, and actually they feel so confident in this player that they do not need her in camp, it is Alyssa Nair. We just saw what she did at the She Believes Cup. We saw how she played in Gold Cup. I think that they are simply using this opportunity to audition the backup goalkeepers to Nair. And like I said, kind of have to think about a different concept of starting and bench. It's possible that they need one of these goalkeepers to play maybe even up to 2 games in this tournament, depending on Nair's fitness level. This is a really good opportunity for that. Casey Murphy has the most caps of these 3. I would say Jane Campbell has probably had the strongest start to the NWSL season. However, Jane Campbell with Houston is probably, of these 3, the question mark of whether or not the way Houston plays or what Houston asks of her, which is a lot of very acrobatic, shot stopping, if it translates to the U.S. Women's National Team level. Because as we know, at the U.S. Women's National Team level, there's a high emphasis on possession, on distribution, on working with maybe a more elite defense, no disrespect to the Dash. It's not always a one-to-one comparison of what the U.S. needs versus just a player that's playing really, really well, maybe behind a leaky defense in the NWSL. So I'm really fascinated to see of those 3, who gets the starts. Still waiting for Aubrey Kingsbury to kind of have her U.S. Women's National Team breakout. I have a theory about some of the Washington Spirit selections that I'm going to save for the midfield. But I do wonder if maybe Kingsbury gets a more serious look, simply because I believe that Hayes and the coaching staff might overall really like what the Spirit are doing right now. But yeah, fascinating. Like I said, I think if there's any player that this is, if she can go, she's going. And so what a great opportunity to check out the other players available, because they're only going to be able to bring one backup on the full roster. Goalkeepers, kind of done and dusted. Moving to defenders. This is a really interesting mix to me. So you have Girma and Davidson, who I think had started to establish a really interesting partnership for the U.S. in the Gold Cup and in She Believes. Davidson and Girma have both kind of had fitness issues over the last month or two. At best, they are not going to want to exacerbate those issues. And so I think the team is going to be very careful, I think, with how they use some of these players. I think, again, you talk about locks. If Girma can go, she's going. Now they have to figure out who is the starting center back beside her. Have to think they like Davidson. Maybe Davidson has pole position for that. But again, if fitness is an issue, they're going to have to figure a true rotation out. I wonder if maybe that's why Emily Sonnet is listed as a defender instead of a midfielder, though, like I said, I don't think that necessarily dictates where a player is going to be on the field. But now we have a new face kind of entering the ring here as a possibility for that third center back role, Sam Staub with Chicago. It's a little bit surprising it's actually taken this long for Staub to get a U.S. Women's National Team call-up. She's been very, very good for the Washington Spirit for years. She is traded to Chicago this offseason, moves to Chicago, and has not really dipped in form at all. A very consistent player. Very consistent player. She's a very good at blocking shots. Her positioning is very strong. And she also has distribution elements to her game that are very valuable in springing in attack. She's very good at long ball distribution. And she also has a long throw in that can generate more set piece like environments without actually having to get a corner kick. So she has a number of tools in her tool belt that you would think would be very, very useful to an international team. The one other thing that Staub really has going in her favor is she is perhaps the most reliable player in terms of fitness in modern NWSL history. She does not get hurt. She does not miss games. Now that I say that, I'm like knocking on wood. But this is something that if you have a couple players that you really like, but they're having trouble with fitness right now, you bring in a player who is fully fit, who is very reliable, who you have a good sense of their skill set. I actually think if there is any player who could possibly truly make it onto this roster in one camp, it would be Staub, just because of the breadth of her portfolio in the league. And again, her sturdiness back there, both just sort of like literally in terms of her ability to play many minutes and also just, again, the way that she plays in the league. I think you could call maybe some snubs in there, right? They're not looking at Abby Dahlkemper. They're not looking at Becky Sauerbrunn. I don't know exactly what that means. Dahlkemper has also been dealing with fitness issues. I think you can probably say, I do think, I could always be wrong, but on an 18-player roster, I think you can maybe say that the U.S. has turned the page on the Becky Sauerbrunn era. As sad as that is, and I think that'll be probably an emotional journey for the team to take probably after the Olympics, because there's just no time right now. And I think with Dahlkemper, we saw some really nice stuff. We saw her struggle sometimes. Again, sort of that sort of terrible, no good outing against Mexico earlier this year. She plays with Girma for the Wave, but neither of them have been playing that much in recent months. So I am interested in what this means for Abby Dahlkemper, but I do think this was a good opportunity to pick and stop. So I don't think that that's a bad move at all. Outside backs. Casey Kruger, Emily Fox, Jenna Neiswanger. So this is interesting, again, by this concept of, are they moving Crystal Dunn out of defensive contention? I don't hate that. I like the idea that the U.S. is willing to, again, kind of turn the page on the Crystal Dunn as outside back era. I think at this point you could argue that Neiswanger, who is also, again, a converted outside back, but kind of what she brings is similar in skill set to Dunn, and she's playing there more consistently as a player in the NWSL and doing a nice job for Gotham. Fox is, I think, a preferred talent. They really like that she can be more of a hybrid. She can dip into the midfield. She can run each line. She can get forward. They like Fox. Again, genuinely believe that Casey Kruger has a shot at this, though I do think that still the biggest issue for her is a quote-unquote lack of versatility. She can play center back in a pinch, but she is a specialty outside back I am curious to see if they feel like it's possible to take an outside back specialist to the Olympics. I actually think in an Olympic Games, bringing an outside back specialist is something to try. I think that the United States sometimes truly has problems keeping the wings locked down, and that has caused issues with the other parts of the defense and also issues with possession. So I like the idea of bringing Casey Kruger. This is, again, maybe the deviation of maybe what I would do and versus the internal thinking of the coaching staff. So very interested to see how this kind of all plays out in these two games and for the final Olympic roster. Moving on to the midfielders. Really interesting group here. Really interesting group. We've got Hal Hirschfeld, who, if that is a name that is new to you, she is a rookie for the Washington Spirit. She's been playing in a double pivot, dual number 6 midfield alongside Andy Sullivan in the Washington Spirit midfield. She's also kind of a tweener, maybe. I mean, I think people might have noticed that she scored some goals early in the season. She can get forward. She can play a more attacking role, but she's been very, very disciplined in sort of that 2 defensive midfielder setup in Washington. Here's my Washington Spirit theory, and I'm curious if people agree with this or not. But Washington Spirit has been kind of going through this tactical change this year, where they have been under an interim manager while they wait for Jonathan Heraldez from Barcelona to come over from Europe once Barcelona's season is over, which is happening shortly. They have been adopting some of the principles. I'm not saying the Washington Spirit or Barcelona, not saying that at all. But they have adopted some of the playing principles that Heraldez was known for with Barcelona. You have a manager like Hayes, who is maybe a little bit more open to what you would call the quote-unquote European style of play. She called in a number of players from Europe into this roster. Maybe the logic behind bringing a player like Hirschfeld in, despite perhaps her inexperience at the professional level, is because if the U.S. is going to play in a double pivot, which we've seen them favor in the past, and I do actually think favors some of the strengths and weaknesses of the other defensive midfielders, quote-unquote defensive midfielders on this roster, which are Sam Coffey, and I do still believe Emily Sonnet, they want it to be purposeful, and they probably want to free Lindsey Horan from having to sit back too much. So I think I understand where this Hirschfeld call-up comes from, genuinely. I also think it's interesting that when you look at that double pivot at Washington and still maybe kind of say no to Andy Sullivan. Now, we know that Sullivan, she didn't have an amazing track record last year as the lone starting number 6 for the U.S. women's national team. She was given a defensive midfield partner. Things started to go a lot better. I am just kind of interested. I don't even know if I have a judgment on it, but I am interested by the fact that Emma Hayes brought in the young player, the recently converted player to this role in partnership with this very steady veteran at the league level and said, okay, maybe we're not looking at that veteran anymore. We're bringing in the rookie. I also think the midfield, when you talk about a player like Albert or a player like Johannes, again, playing that long game, I don't know what Emma Hayes is thinking, but I would be surprised if Albert or Johannes made the 18-player Olympic roster. I just don't think I've seen enough from Albert on the field, and Johannes is still a very rising prospect. She's only 16. But these are the players that you continue to develop because you're thinking about next year and the year after that and the year after that. And we've talked about Johannes being a unique prospect in that the U.S. is kind of competing for her talents with the Netherlands. And so I am curious about the U.S. using this roster spot for Johannes. This is not a win now idea. This is more about the cultivation of the player pool. And I like that. I really do. I think, again, but you always have to think, okay, what are the expectations of the coaching squad for the Olympics? What are the ultimate goals out of this year? I like that we're not seeing just a win now group, but it does create, like I said, some of those more imbalances of, I don't know if I look at this midfield and I go, yes, I think that's the midfield crusher for this really, really difficult Olympic tournament. I would like to see Hirschfeld and Coffey play together. I'd like to see Hirschfeld and Sonnet play together in the defensive midfield. I would like them to play with Rose Lavelle because Lavelle is kind of the only true attacking midfield playmaker in this midfield group. Some of that is because of who's been designated a forward. We'll talk about that in a second. But I think that there are a lot of interesting combinations here. But I would probably, maybe again, this is what I would like to see. I would like to see the players who probably are going to Paris to get the playing time in the midfield. I think that you need to get people into the camp environment for a number of different reasons. But I do think at this point you have to start building those connections and getting into go time. So moving to forwards. You talk about versatility. Oh my goodness. I don't know how you picked this forward line. Crystal Dunn, Katarina Macario, Alex Morgan, Rodman, Shaw, Smith, Swanson. I was trying to kind of designate sort of positionally how I would categorize a lot of these players. You know, I'm like, okay, you got Crystal Dunn. Of course, forward Crystal Dunn. Outside back, number 8 midfielder, possibly number 10 playmaker, central forward, but also has been playing winger for Gotham, Crystal Dunn. That's why Crystal Dunn, I think, will make this roster. She can play anywhere but goalkeeper. Is that the best use of her abilities? Probably not. Have we probably gotten too far into her career to make her a specialist now? Probably. But I just don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. And I don't think putting her in the forward list changes the fact that she can play a lot of different positions. And she's been getting forward a lot more for Gotham with Midge Purse out. But I am fascinated kind of to see kind of who you would cut to put her into the forward line, because you also have the very, very versatile Sophia Smith. I'm like, she can play right wing, left wing. She can play center forward. She can play pretty much anywhere on the front line. Again, you could argue about the effectiveness, but maybe for Sophia Smith, the answer is less about, oh, she can play anywhere. And it is more about like, how do you get her into the best positions on the field? How do you get that blazing NWSL form to translate to the U.S. women's national team level consistently? You have Mallory Swanson, who I think is probably pretty well positioned at left winger at this point for the U.S., but as we know, she can drop into more of a playmaking role. She has to do that a lot for Chicago to kind of make up for some of their midfield gaps. Jaden Shaw, they have Jaden Shaw listed as a forward. As we know, she can play left wing. She can also play false 9. She can also fall completely back into the midfield. I think I've said this before, Jaden Shaw, you want to have on your Olympic roster. Her versatility is really, really valuable, but now that puts the impetus on the coaching staff to make her as effective as she can possibly be. Because if you talk about a player who actually could win you some games in this competition, Jaden Shaw. Rodman, I think we see pretty much well established in the right wing position. Macario and Morgan, I find sort of, well, gosh, it's been so long actually that Macario and Morgan have truly been vying for an international tournament roster. That dream got cut short so early into the 2023 World Cup process that this is it's like I'm opening up the archives of my mind if I'm actually thinking about Macario versus Morgan again. I haven't thought about this since 2022. Two very, very different players. Morgan is a player that you start for her leadership. She has an ability to score that's been improving at the international level in 2024. She can play back to goal. I do not think she's really a strong target forward anymore, but that's why you have speedy wingers. And I just think, again, through sheer willingness over the last couple of years, she has really carved herself into a player that is willing to make adjustments based on her teammates' tendencies, which I think is fantastic. So I like bringing in Morgan. Like I said, I feel like this is like the audition on the audition on the audition of like Alex Morgan is so close to the finish line of making this Olympic roster possibly her last in her career, but it's still just this re-audition for a brand new coach. Macario is very familiar with the brand new coach. They come from the same club. Macario has been coming back from injury. We've yet to see her really consistently put full 90s together. She has been a very, very good dead ball specialist. She's the kind of person that you want taking your corner kicks and taking your free kicks. She also has just had really nice service from wide. I'm not advocating for Macario, the wide player, but she is someone who can put a ball on a platter, and that is the thing that has come back quickest in her return from her long rehabilitation from her ACL. She can play more like a false 9. Again, she can sit back a little bit more. Again, not really a target forward, but it seems like that's not really how the U.S. wants to play or feels like they are set up to play. So I don't know. Do you play Macario and Morgan together? Do you play Morgan in front of Macario? Do you play them separately because you consider Macario to be a forward? Do you play Shaw and Lavelle in a rotation because you think that both can be kind of that underlying playmaker role? Do you play them at the same time? Do you go with the more conservative midfield and the very attacking front line? Like, do you have Haran as your highest point in the midfield to set up those passing channels, but also you expect Shaw to drop back? I think there's a lot of different ways that Hayes could approach this. But then that kind of brings us to, I think, perhaps the biggest snub, which there were big question marks, I think, in that Lynn Williams was not on this roster. Lynn Williams, like a lot of these players who were named, has kind of been dealing with some fitness stuff. Did not play much at the beginning of the season, but has been working her way into very consistent reps with Gotham. She's getting her scoring form back. As we saw, she passed a very big milestone in the NWSL just last weekend. She can play wide. She can play centrally. She is a full team defender who can really affect your ability to press, and we've seen the U.S. do very well in a high press. She's not quite the goal scorer at the international level that she is at the club level, but I think I've always been an advocate for all of the other things that she does very well can make up for that if you put her into the right system. I don't think it's an either or with Morgan or an either or with Macario or even with Smith. I do think it could just be a numbers game. I think that there are just different players giving different looks. I think that perhaps Hayes is concerned. I don't think that Hayes has the ability perhaps to cut a veteran like Alex Morgan without even seeing her in camp, right? But I am curious if Williams is the first player off and if that manifests in any different type of way, considering kind of fitness and form. But I do hope that she continues to be considered, because I would like to think that her increased versatility, not only on her ability to play centrally in addition to wide, but also just how she's continued to compete at the club level as a goal scorer, is something that's worth consideration, because I think that I haven't seen what Lynn Williams has done to be dropped. That some of these other players, I don't think that there's a huge difference at the club level. Like, what is the difference at this point between how Alex Morgan is competing at the club level versus Lynn Williams? So I think you take a lot of other factors into consideration, but I am, again, maybe just curious as to why Williams was left off. And I imagine that's something that Hayes will be asked in her first media availability, and also what that means for her and for the players who are on this roster who, like I said, close to the finish line, but still auditioning. Other maybe players that I think it's, again, tough. I mean, it's really hard to advocate. I'm going to be honest. It's very hard to advocate for bubble players in an Olympic year because it's just 18 players. But I do think that Ashley Sanchez has been very good in the league this year. I think that Savannah DeMello has been very good in the league this year. I think that maybe we're seeing them fall to the philosophy of needing to develop some of these players who are playing in Europe, these younger players that Hayes maybe feels is a little bit closer to how she would like the U.S. to play overall. It's very nice to see Lavelle back. I know that Hayes thinks very highly of her. Hayes actually wrote in sort of a treatise during last year's World Cup that the U.S. doesn't have enough players like Lavelle. I would like to think that what we're seeing in the player pool is proving that wrong, but just a good indication of how much Hayes rates Lavelle if she can play. But yeah, I think, does this look like a group that can go out and win the Olympics tomorrow? I don't know. But I think we've also seen surprises from them in the Gold Cup. We've seen surprises from them at She Believes. And I do think that this is both the short and the long game for Hayes. Fascinated to see who makes the game day 18. Fascinated to see who gets playing time. It'll be interesting to see if we even feel like we can evaluate playing style or preferences out of these games. It's a short runway, and the U.S. is going to have to kind of live or die by the process that they went through in order to get Hayes, which is that she is kind of meeting the team, not like personally, but as a group for the first time when it is now crunch time for the Olympics. So very excited for these games. Can't wait to see what happens. Let me know what you guys think. Who are your biggest snubs? Who are your biggest surprises? What would you like to see? And what do you think Hayes is trying to implement internally? Let's do some double analysis in the comments, and we will see you next time with our more normal programming with the Late Sub.